Welcome to Inspiring Perspectives, a podcast by thinkPARALLAX featuring fresh takes and bold ideas for the real-world sustainability challenges and solutions at some of the world's most respected brands and companies. I'm your host, Derek Sabori, and this is what sustainability sounds like today. Well, hey everyone, welcome back to Inspiring Perspectives. This is the show where we turn to experts in this space with the aim to deliver valuable takeaways and actionable advice on a wide range of topics that are being talked about in corporate sustainability. So to help me with that today, to accomplish that, I'm here with Sarah Martinez, Vice President, ESG at Prime Data Centers. Sarah, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
I'm excited about this conversation. I think we're going to cover a lot in our session today, but let's start with your role in the company. This is a first for us, data centers. What do we need to know about data centers? What are you working on there, and what does that entail?
Sure, yeah. Well, let me just give a little bit of background on what Prime Data Centers, who we are and what we do. So we are an international co-location data center provider. And what that means is that we build, own, and operate data centers for tech companies, cloud providers, AI companies, etc. We are in the US and Europe is our current footprint. And data centers, there's starting to be more discussion in the mainstream press about data centers, largely around how energy intensive they are and how AI is really driving an increase in energy consumption in this country, right? More broadly. I think this is probably the first time many people have even thought about data centers, right? We're all tethered to our phones, but not many people think about the digital infrastructure that's required to enable our digital lives. And so data centers are the buildings that house the servers that make the internet and all the digital aspects of our lives work.
Yeah, it's like the heartbeats. It's the heart of the whole system that we rely on, right?
Yeah,
and
exactly.
And it's really interesting because you shifted from the corporate space to the brand space to something that's a little more behind the scenes. So what are you working on there in terms of ESG and sustainability? What does your role entail there? What's your primary focus area?
Yeah, sure. So as the VP of ESG, my job is to try to embed considerations across the board into how Prime operates and how we make decisions. One of the first things I did when I started at the company earlier this year was to do a formal materiality assessment, which is an exercise many companies do when they take a step back to say, okay, let's be thoughtful about our ESG or sustainability priorities and make sure that we're aligning where we are focusing with what our stakeholders care about. And so I spent a lot of time trying to understand what are our customers talking about in terms of sustainability, right? Our customers being the large tech companies. What are our investors asking us about? What are our employees asking us about, right? Employees are an incredibly important stakeholder for our company. And pretty much across the board, the most important issue, the issue I was seeing most often discussed and in the greatest depth was anything related to energy, climate, and renewable power. So I do want to say that my scope is broad. I am helping the company think through making sure that we have an inclusive workforce. How do we volunteer in the community? Making sure we have strong ethics programs and cybersecurity, right? For example, those are all topics under the ESG bucket. But in terms of where I do spend most of my time, it really is focused on the areas of energy and climate. And then within that, there's the operational climate impact. So all of the energy the data centers use to operate, to run all the AI queries that are happening right now. But then there's also what we call embodied carbon. So what are the emissions associated with the construction and development of the building, the carbon that's embodied in the building before we even turn on a light switch or install a server. And so we're trying to look at our climate impacts from those two angles because they both represent an opportunity to decarbonize. One thing that I found interesting, being new to the data center world myself, I was surprised to learn that the average, call it, ChatGPT, whatever, AI query, can use 10 times the amount of electricity as a standard Google search, right?
Ooh, yeah. And as you were saying that, I was almost like, don't tell me, I don't want to know.
I know. I know, right? It's like you can't unknow that now, right? And AI is doing so many great things, right? I mean, AI is helping to address climate change by improving efficient technologies. It's, AI is being used to remove ocean plastic. So it's not, I try to not think of it as AI versus sustainability. That's not the right framing, but we need to think about how can we live in a society where AI is enabling our growth and our knowledge, but in a way that meets the realities of the climate constraints that we face as a society. And so we have made a commitment that we will be powered by 100% renewable electricity by 2030. And so that, and honestly, what's very helpful from my perspective is that many of our customers have similar goals, right? If you go to large tech companies' websites and open up their sustainability reports, many of them are talking about net zero and science-based targets. And so this is really an opportunity for us to align with what our customers are trying to do from a climate perspective.
So I've got a question on that, and that's a really important point. I think we talk a lot about Scope 3 emissions and collaborating with your supply chain. And if you're looking at Google or Amazon, next in line, they're going to say, hey, we can only do so much. Now it goes to our data centers, right? And so if you're saying, hey, we will be powered by renewable energy, then you're doing that part and you become a really valuable resource to them and a valuable partner with them to help them achieve your goals. Who helps you achieve then your goals, right? Because is the grid ready for that? Is there enough there? Because I would imagine we just have to keep passing it on, right? You have to turn and go, okay, we've got a commitment. Yeah. You go to your utility company or the local grid. Is that right? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Grid reliability and ability to meet the growing needs for electricity in this country is a huge challenge. There are many people focused on this and rightfully concerned about it, frankly. So if you look at electricity consumption in our country, it's been pretty flat for the, call it 15, 20 years, where our economy was growing, but our efforts to advance energy efficiency were working. So if you looked at what utilities had to deliver, it was pretty steady, right? And then with the advent of generative AI, it's like a hockey stick, right? And so our utility industries, the grid was just not set up. Really, any industry is going to struggle when you face that much increase in demand all at once. Right. And so what we're seeing now is companies are trying to get power whenever and however they can, because the need for data centers is so great that there is just this, laser focus on where can I get power, how soon can I get it? Because we'll go to a utility, about certain projects, and it can be years before they're able to deliver what we need for that building. So go ahead.
Probably despite price, it's like price isn't so much an issue. It's like, when can you deliver it? Can I make sure I have it? And how soon is it coming? And how much can I get?
That's right. That's right. And just to dig a little deeper on the challenges of it, there's the generation of power, which is one aspect, right? So it's great. There was an article in Canary Media last month that looked at the new power generation that came online in the first half of 2024. And I think it was about 20 gigawatts of electricity power, and 97% of it was carbon-free solar, wind, battery, nuclear. So that's incredible.
Yep.
The challenge is that because our demand is going like this and because it is so great, we're not retiring the fossil fuel-based resources as more renewables are coming online, because we just need every kilowatt hour that we can
Everything counts. And I was out at Climate Week a couple of weeks ago, and that was a big conversation. There was somebody, I forgot who it was, but was just saying, we cannot, if we're going to hit our goal, right, if we're going to hit our net zero goal and everybody is reducing by 50% and then driving down to zero, we cannot be opening up and starting new carbon or fossil fuel or coal burning plants, right? So if we're not shutting those down and closing those down, and if we are continuing to use them, it just won't work, regardless of how much renewable energy we put onto the grid. Is that kind of what you're feeling and hearing? It sounds like
that's exactly what I'm hearing. And it's concerning. You see many organizations that are not on track to meet their climate commitments just because of that reality that you just described. I've been working in the corporate sustainability space for quite a while, and I kind of think of my career as having 3 different chapters. So in the early days, you were just excited if you could get a recycling bin in the kitchenette, right?
I remember those days.
Sustainability teams, if a company had one, you were kind of operating on the fringes and trying to do what you could, right? And then in around 2000, the early aughts, a lot of companies were setting net zero targets, zero waste targets, right? You started to see these big commitments from big brands. And frankly, it was so exciting.
Yeah.
I think the reality is that the people who were setting those goals and the executives that were approving those goals, they all knew they probably weren't going to be in those roles when the time was up, right? We're talking long-term goals, 2030, 2050. And so now 2030 is around the corner.
Yep.
And so we're at this really interesting and challenging point where, again, as discussed earlier, a lot of companies are going in the wrong direction. And so we are going to need to determine, are we going to make good on those commitments? And if we do, that means sustainability, internally a company's sustainability team needs to have a meaningful seat at the table when these business decisions are being made.
For you guys there at Prime, I was wondering, so your title is ESG. Was that kind of was that role or that definition already there, or did you decide that, hey, are we going to do ESG or is it going to be sustainability? And how does this fit into the organization? How's it going over there? And what was that thought process like?
Yeah. Coming into the organization, the decision had already been made that the scope would be ESG, to take a broad approach.
Yep.
And having a presence in Europe, that's really what's expected across the pond. And frankly, to me, that was important to me. That it makes sense for so much of my time and for Prime to be focused on the E of ESG. But I think fundamentally, roles like mine are thinking about how do organizations manage their impacts on society in a broad way. And I think to try to separate the E from the S from the G can be tricky and challenging. We really need to be thinking about our impacts on society holistically.
Yeah. Well, we're going to come back. I want to touch on leadership, because I think today we're going to cover kind of all the lessons learned, because you, prior to this role, had spent some time in sustainability roles at companies that most of our listeners have probably heard of. Target, Clorox company, Walt Disney company. What were some of the lessons, Sarah, that you've learned and some of the differences that you've seen between working in larger or very large companies, smaller ones, different industries? Walk us through some of those differences that you've seen.
Sure. Yeah, I think at very large organizations that I had the pleasure of working at, one of the aspects that's frankly can be helpful is that as a consumer-facing brand, there can be more consumer pressure and expectation for those brands to be managing their environmental and social impacts versus a B2B company, right, that I'm at right now.
Yep.
But at companies that large, the executives are often more removed from the nitty-gritty of sustainability, right? The work that needs to be done. And it is incredibly important, and it takes a lot of time and focused effort to get executives on board in a meaningful way, right? Where they truly do understand what does sustainability mean to the business. I think that obviously with a large organization, the potential for impact is so much bigger, right? If you can move the needle at a place like Target or Clorox or Disney, that's super exciting, right? That's the opportunity for real impact.
Sure.
It's also like turning the Titanic. Larger organizations, by definition, I think can be, slower to change and to evolve. Leadership is always important for driving sustainability. I think at large organizations, it's particularly important because often leaders are, they are judged on their objectives that have been set, that they have set with their leadership that can cascade down from on high. And so if sustainability is not part of that communication, if it's not part of the goal setting, it can be very challenging for teams to dedicate their resources to try to advance sustainability. One of the things I love working at a smaller, more nimble organization is the fact that it is more nimble, right? The fact that because we are smaller, I just have more access to our C-suite, right? And to be able to have those conversations and educate them and bring them on. Thankfully at Prime, our leadership team is very much personally committed. So I have a lot of support, which is great. But just have the access to those conversations is really important. And even though Prime is smaller right now, because we're earlier in our development as an organization, if we can embed sustainability into how we operate and how we think and how we go to market, then that's sort of baked into who we are. So as we grow, that impact will expand over time.
Right. And so speaking of time, and one of the things that we spoke about, you said you've been doing this for a long time, the role of sustainability in the organization has changed. And you said it's increasingly becoming an accounting and reporting function, right? That's something we hear all about, especially with different regulations coming, CSRD, whether it's from the SEC or out of the EU. It is becoming more and more, more of a requirement to have very strong reporting, data, and checks and balances, disclosure, transparency, et cetera. How has that changed the role for you? Kind of back in those early days, you said of the break room with the recycling bins, there was a little more freedom, and it was an excitement of just kind of uncharted territory and pioneerism, if you will. Today, the role requires maybe a different skill set, right? How has it evolved in your eyes?
It has evolved. You're right. From more of kind of the scrappy, team on the fringes to really being integrated into corporate planning and disclosure and measurement. I think that as that change has evolved, I view it as a really great thing. And also there's a little piece of me that's kind of sad. And what I mean by that, I'll speak to the first part first. So it's great because I think if we want to achieve a more sustainable society where the environmental and social impacts, on society are embedded into corporate decision making, then ESG issues should be integrated into disclosure and reporting. And so the fact that that space has matured in such a way that now sustainability teams are working, right side by side with financial reporting teams, with legal teams, and the disclosures are being treated on a wholly different level, right? There's much more scrutiny, as there should be, but there's much more process, there's much more rigor, again, as there should be. But that is a very different way of operating and thinking from the scrappy kind of outsider trying to push for change. I heard a quote at a conference a while back, and somebody said, if you ask sustainability people to become accountants, they will quit, right? That's just not the skill set or kind of the mindset, right? Of kind of why many people got into this realm of thinking. I like to think of us as the group, like we're the dog that caught the car, right? We were trying to be taken seriously. We were trying to get a seat at the table. And now that that's happened, we're kind of like, whoa, what is this all about? We have to rethink our role and how we operate. Overall, it's a great thing. I always say, if your background is accounting, if you work in accounting or financial reporting, disclosure, legal, and you are passionate about sustainability, now is your time to shine, right? Those worlds are converging. And I know people who have, kind of come up in the accounting world, but always personally had a passion for these issues. And now they're thrilled about the fact that they can bring those together. I will say, I don't know as many sustainability people that have a passion for accounting. Again, these teams are working more closely together, which is a good thing.
So what do you think sustainability leadership requires then today? So coming into it, getting into a role like yours, what are we looking for then from sustainability leaders?
Yeah, I think, when I started in this space, I thought what was most important was really the technical knowledge. For example, what does the greenhouse gas protocol say about calculating scope 3, right? Kind of understanding the nitty gritty. Yep. And now I have a deeper appreciation for the fact that while that is, of course, important and essential for the job, really what's needed today is the ability to first understand core business functions and core business objectives, and the ability to work collaboratively cross-functionally to then understand how can sustainability be embedded into different departments, different aspects of the business. Sustainability folks, it's not like we can just come in and say, this is what we need to do, and then we go do it, right? As an example, if a company wants to ask its supply chain, its suppliers, how are you monitoring human rights risks in your operations? The sustainability team can lay out the questions that should be asked, can provide context for the procurement team, but at the end of the day, it's the procurement team that is actually going to update how a company engages its suppliers.
Right.
And so I think what's really crucial today are those soft skills and the ability to find mutual points of benefit that can advance sustainability while also supporting whatever the business is trying to do just from a core business perspective.
Yeah, that's interesting. And that comes with time and experience, having worked at multiple organizations and across different positions, and being able to build relationships with people, right? And really understand where they're coming from and what their needs are. You mentioned leadership. What examples have you seen of strong leadership that supports sustainability? I guess, what does it take from a CEO level or a COO level? What do you look for in strong sustainability leaders in that case? Because to your point, they're probably not focused on sustainability. Maybe it's a part of their job, right? They also have everything else to worry about. So what are some good examples of strong sustainability leadership that you've seen from the top?
I think an openness and a curiosity is really important, right? You're right. A CEO has a million things on their plate that they're looking at and that they're monitoring. Because truly embedding sustainability throughout a business, it's still fairly new, even though some of us have been at this a long time. I think the conversations we're having now about more meaningful integration into the business, we're still early in those stages. And so, of course, a leader needs to have some level of personal buy-in, but then I think curiosity and openness to learning from the sustainability team and the sustainability leaders, how does this fit into our business? How does this advance? That's incredibly important. So when Prime Data Centers was setting our goal for 100% renewable energy, my coworkers and I, we had done all of our financial analysis and laid out, these are a number of commitments we could make. These are the pathways. Here would be the financial implications. But we also said, here are our customers who have these goals, right? And when our customers are trying to decarbonize part of the emissions that they are trying to get to zero, those are the emissions associated with our data centers that they're going to lease from us, right?
Is most of their emissions, would you say, a good amount, I would imagine, come from your footprint? Is that right? Do you know off the top what percent of their emissions come from?
That's a good question, because many tech companies own their own data centers. They have their own, and then they lease some as well.
Okay.
And so it probably varies from company to company.
Sure. Yep. Yeah. How about for you guys? What percent of your emissions are, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3? Because typically most companies are like, hey, 70 to 90% of our emissions are scope 3, not on us, and we're struggling to get it. Are most of your emissions on sites that you own and operate, or are they still downstream or upstream?
Most of ours are scope 3 as well.
Okay.
So we're not unique in that regard.
Yep.
And I mentioned we're a co-location data center provider. So we develop, own, and operate the building, and then we lease data halls to tech companies.
That's right.
And so part of our scope 3 is associated with the electricity to operate the customer's servers. So they lease the space from us. They bring in their servers. It's their operational control. So it's their scope 2, our scope 3. And in fact, there's actually conversations right now within the data center industry of where exactly do you draw the line between scope 2 and scope 3, because how you define operational control gets pretty tricky. So for example, Prime will install the mechanical equipment to cool the building, but then the customer will tell us what temperature it needs to be set at. Right? So we kind of both have our fingerprints, if you will, on the emissions associated with that energy. So that's an ongoing conversation, and an example of how we're still kind of early in this space where our industry hasn't even aligned on how are we splitting 2 and 3 when you look at the electricity associated with a data center.
Sure. Gosh, interesting. So much to talk about there, but it sounds like you're working through it, and it just goes to show. Yeah, but all supply chains can be really complex, and it takes partnership and everybody working together and owning up to it. Really, another question I have is in terms of going back to leadership and your team, as you're talking through this and knowing sort of where you started, where you're at today, the language has evolved, and there's so much to learn and understand. And do you see leadership really starting to tune in and have a good understanding of what do we mean when we're talking about Scope 3 emissions and the importance and the difference, Scope 1, Scope 2, and, CDP and greenhouse gas? And, do they get it, or are they just like, Sarah, just handle it. Let me know what we need to do, what budget you need?
I will say the level of awareness of at least Scopes 1, 2, and 3 is very high at Prime. I would imagine at other data center companies as well, just because the whole issue of greenhouse gas accounting is really elevating in importance. I would say once you get into CDP versus TCFD versus ISSB, that's where probably there's still not as much awareness, right? So that's when fair. I have those conversations with leadership, it's more about at a high level, there are third-party frameworks that we can use to disclose our story, and we want to understand which frameworks are most relevant to our customers, investors, et cetera, without getting too much into the weeds.
And that goes back to the art of the role of being able to do that and give them just enough, give them what they need. What about for somebody that's newly assigned to a sustainability position? They're a new sustainability lead. They may or may not have experience in the space. Where do you suggest that they start?
Yeah. I would suggest that they spend some time trying to get an honest read of where leadership stands on sustainability. Frankly, some companies, they might hire a sustainability person and there might not even be clarity at the highest levels on why, right? And that is not my situation at Prime Data Centers, just to be clear. But I've definitely heard of some folks say like, oh, check the box, right?
Yeah.
We need a sustainability person. We'll bring them on. Okay, well, why am I here? And what do you want me to do, right?
And what resources do I have?
Yeah, exactly. And some companies don't know that on day one. And that's okay, right? It's all a journey. It's all part of the process. But I think trying to understand, where does leadership sit on sustainability? And if they don't know, can you help them craft in their head why it's important? And you know what? If the true honest answer is because our peers are doing it and because we feel we need to check the box, if there's at least internal clarity that that's where you're at, that's important to know, right? That's going to tell you a lot about how aggressive, and aspirational you can be. So I think understanding what's really driving the company, that will inform where you are on the spectrum of aspiration. And then you can tailor your approach appropriate to that, right? So I think getting a read on leadership, understanding where they're at. I also think benchmarking is hugely important. What are your peers doing? What are your peers saying? What are your customers asking for? What are your investors asking about? Because when a sustainability person is going to try to get approval and sign off for whatever initiative or goal it is that they're pushing for, that's incredibly valuable information to have, and it can help frame up the conversation with leadership. And then I'd also say you cannot invest too much time in establishing and building your internal relationships, just getting to know your stakeholders, understanding what drives them, both from a business perspective, but just building personal relationships as well, right? We all enjoy working with people we like and that we get along with and that we are aligned with, right? And so again, I think it's those soft skills that are important. Of course, you're going to need to know the technical aspects. Yes, if you're in a carbon accounting world, you better know the greenhouse gas protocol. But I would say that is secondary to building those connections internally, because that's how you're truly going to advance initiatives.
Yeah, finding your allies. It sounds like what you're talking about is year one. Year one, you're building allies, building relationships, getting a lay of the land, understanding leadership, doing some benchmarking. I really like this. And then just getting that internal buy-in. So let's say then year two, they get a budget. What's the first thing they should go and spend that money on?
Yeah, I think it would go back to what are the most important issues for the organization. And that should be informed by what your stakeholders care about, right? And when I say stakeholders, I mean internal stakeholders as well. So I had the opportunity to sit down with our CEO and CFO to get their read on what issues they thought were most important, right? So bringing together executive priorities, customer priorities, investors, et cetera. Whatever issues bubble up to the top as a result of those conversations and as a result of that leadership, that's where you should focus. So I can't give you an answer of X issue because it should be different for every company depending on where they're at and what they do and what their stakeholders are focused on.
And going back to that materiality assessment that you did, just sort of understanding like what are the material topics to you, what's important to your all of your stakeholders. Really good point.
Yeah.
You talked a little bit about what it means to build or what it takes to build a successful program or movement. Then, just overall, we've talked about allyship, getting leadership involved, stakeholder engagement. Is it important then to start reaching out to your suppliers and your customers as well and telling them, are you getting information from them or telling them what you're doing, or is it a mix of both?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say at the end of the day, it's ultimately a mix of both.
Mm-hmm.
It's important to come to that conversation having done your homework so you acknowledge what they prioritize. One thing I've also noticed in my time in working with different, whether it's a customer or a supplier, the person at the table who's the main point of contact for your organization, they might not be that plugged in to their own sustainability program, right? Especially if your supplier is a huge multinational company that's making X widgets or equipment or whatever, you're probably going to first talk to a salesperson and hopefully they're up to speed. But I've noticed sometimes then when you get a couple layers deeper on the issues and what's important, they may not know, and hopefully they bring in their sustainability people. I think that's a real sweet spot is when you are talking to specifically customers and suppliers, when their sustainability people are at the table as well, just so you can be speaking the same language. That I think can lead to the most productive conversations.
Yeah, and you hit on a topic that's really important to us is just building a foundational knowledge, doing some training across the board, because it seems like once you get out of the sustainability department, which is sometimes a department of one, it just, the information just becomes like very limited in terms of what language we're using, how to speak about it correctly and use the right terms. But it's important to bake it into all of the roles in the organization. So I think that's something that we really push for as well. Yeah. So I know we've just got a few minutes left here, so I want to ask you a couple last things if I can. But how are you feeling about things overall? You've seen the landscape change. You're watching just sort of sustainability and ESG evolve at a really rapid pace. How do you feel? Are you optimistic? Are you frustrated? Do you feel like we're moving in the right direction? Is there great progress happening? You're working with some big companies. What are you seeing? How are you feeling?
I'm seeing all the above in different times and different ways of what you mentioned. Ultimately, I am optimistic. We are moving in a direction where sustainability is being taken more seriously than I've ever seen it, right? That there are large commitments, visible commitments, and large companies are trying to grapple with this and figure it out. That being said, especially when it comes to data centers and just the state of electricity consumption, energy consumption in our country in general, I have short-term heartburn because of the need to get power whenever and however we can.
Yeah.
I think that we may be in a situation where we sacrifice progress short term when it comes to climate goals because our grid, as I said, is struggling to keep up and ramp up with demand. My hope is that once we get over that hump, once the supply of energy has sorted itself out, I am confident that sustainability is going to come back to the top of the agenda, that there's going to be more focus on the importance of meeting climate goals and emissions reduction goals. But we just have some short-term challenges that are going to be, really, really tricky to deal with.
Yeah. You mentioned Canary Media. I like that site, and shout out to Shale Khan and the Catalyst podcast, one of my favorites. But is there anything else that that you use for inspiration and motivation right now? Who do you keep an eye on? Who do you look to get some intel and motivation?
Oh, that is such a good question. When I open up my LinkedIn feed, there's just so many great ideas and thoughts out there.
That's fair,
Yeah. We are Prime is a member of iMasons, which is an industry group for digital infrastructure.
Okay.
And we participate in their Climate Accord, which brings together cross-functional groups to work across the industry to tackle big challenges, such as reporting and figuring out embodied carbon and coming up with common language. And so when I'm on those calls with large tech companies and with our peers or competitors, it's always just it's wonderful to hear how a lot of people and organizations are trying to tackle these issues.
Yeah. Okay. Well, this will be my last question. Let's wrap up with this. Let's try to summarize it all. If we're offering some sustainability advice for sustainability success in your organization, and you just had to kind of real quickly say, here's what it takes to have a successful sustainability or ESG program, regardless of your company's size, what do you tell somebody?
Find your internal advocates, right? Invest in those relationships, build them. I cannot overstate how important that is. Spend time understanding what issues you should be focused on, what makes the most business sense, as well as environmental and social impact, because you really want to be rooted in strategy as you are trying to advance different goals and initiatives and priorities. And then third, try to stay optimistic and don't give up, right? This is a difficult space in many ways because we're trying to tackle such systemic challenges that aren't going to be solved overnight. But there is an army of people out there trying to do the good work.
Well, that's so good. Sarah, thank you so much. Thanks for the great advice and all the good stories. Good luck on all the challenges you're having over there and on the success that you're seeing. Keep it going. Keep up the great work.
Thank you, and thanks again for the opportunity.
Hey, thanks for checking out our show today. This show was produced by the team at thinkPARALLAX, a sustainability and communications agency with 2 decades of experience working with companies at every stage of the sustainability journey. We are experts at assessing where a company is today, defining a North Star, and developing a roadmap to get there. If your team needs sustainability guidance or training, or you have a recommendation for a guest or a topic on the show, visit us at thinkparallax.com. We'd love to hear from you.